and welcome to another installment of Conservation Conversations with BirdLife South Africa. I'm your host, Melissa Howes-Whitecross, and I'd like to welcome all of our viewers tuning in through Zoom and Facebook Live tonight. You can communicate with us through the chat room and ask your questions for the speakers throughout the webinar using the Q&A box in Zoom. Our speakers will answer these at the end of the webinar, and if you're tuning in on Facebook Live, you can send us your questions and comments using the comment feed on Facebook. Now, tonight marks our 20th episode since we started this journey on 14 April, when we were unsure of what lay ahead for us as a country and a global community. While we are by no means out of the woods, the start of level 2 lockdown in South Africa has certainly brought some hope and positivity to the South Africans, and I hope that everyone has had a chance to book their holidays, which may have been impending the postponement under level 3 lockdown. Stay safe out there, and thank you for spending your Tuesday nights with us. We promise to keep you entertained on Tuesdays until the end of 2020, and look forward to sharing even more exciting and interesting conservation conversations with all of you. We're also very excited to announce that all of our webinars will be available in podcast format going forward. So if you'd like to listen to these talks on any of your upcoming road trips or wherever you like to listen to our content, keep an eye on our website to find out where you can access those audio files. And a big thank you to volunteer Carl Bierman for stepping up to help us put this podcast together. We're active across all major social media platforms. You can use the hashtag Conservation Conversations if you'd like to engage with us, or let us know that you're tuning in tonight. If you missed out on any of the previous webinars, you can catch up on any of the previous episodes on the BirdLife South Africa YouTube channel. Don't forget that you can support the production of these webinars by donating through the Cricut platform. Just scan that QR code or visit the donations website via our BirdLife South Africa website. We really do value all the support received so far that is helping us to keep these webinars free for all to learn and enjoy. So a big thank you to all of you who have donated to us so far. Next week, we will be announcing the winner of this month's Jacana Media Monthly Giveaway competition. So be sure to enter if you are based in South Africa so that you can stand a chance to win these 4 fantastic titles from Jacana Media. And to enter, you can visit our Conservation Conversations website to find the links. We're also excited to announce a new Zeiss Optics giveaway. They've put together an exciting hamper for our viewers. And after tonight's webinar, we will be carrying out a lucky draw for all of the South African-based viewers, and we'll be announcing the winner at the end of the webinar. All you need to do is stay tuned, and we will then be doing the random draw to announce exactly who will get this amazing giveaway. And in these COVID-19 times, this really is an exciting pack to get. It's full of fun, exciting sanitizing equipment and good smartphone wipes and all sorts of things to keep you safe. So keep an eye on our webinar next week and make sure to see who wins that awesome Zeiss Optics prize. And a big thank you to Zeiss for joining the Conservation Conversations family. Now, the first ever African Bird Fair is coming to your screens, and this year it's a virtual African Bird Fair. So keep an eye on all of our websites and media feeds to find out exactly what's going on. The team has been hard at work to secure top speakers and exhibitors from across the continent and the globe. So diarize 5th September and make sure to join us at the virtual African Bird Fair. Tonight, I'm excited to welcome our panel of experts to discuss the important science, concerns, and solutions around the threat posed by lead to wildlife and society at large. Our first presenter is Linda van den Heever, BirdLife South Africa's Vulture Project Manager. Linda is responsible for the implementation of vulture safe zones and mitigating the impact of lead poisoning in vultures, a topic which she is currently pursuing for her PhD at the University of Pretoria. We are also joined by one of Linda's PhD supervisors, Professor Vinny Naidoo, Dean of the Faculty of Veterinary Science at the University of Pretoria. Prof Naidoo's research focuses on new pharmaceutical product development, pharmacokinetic evaluations of drug effect, and preclinical toxicology in animals. He has authored over 100 peer-reviewed publications and has been directly involved with vulture conservation for the last 15 years, playing a major role in mitigating the devastating effects of the diclofenac drug to vultures. Our next speaker will also be Ian Rushworth, who is a conservation biologist and scientific manager working for Ezemvelo KZN Wildlife. He holds an MSc in conservation biology from the Fitzpatrick Institute of African Ornithology at the University of Cape Town, and coordinates scientific support to protected areas in KwaZulu-Natal. Over the past 28 years, Ian has worked on a wide range of projects and programs on both indigenous and alien invasive species, including a long-term contribution to vulture conservation programs and recent involvement in invasive house crow strategies. He's also the current chairman of the National Lead Task Team, and this is a subgroup of the National Wildlife Poisoning Prevention Working Group that is hosted by the Department of Environment, Forestry and Fisheries. Our final speaker this evening is going to be Lizanne Nel, who is currently the Conservation Manager for the SA Hunters and Game Conservation Association, the largest hunting and conservation association in Southern Africa. Lizanne has more than 30 years of experience in the development of sustainable conservation solutions for the responsible use of biodiversity, and she holds an MBA and BSc Honours in Wildlife Management, also from the University of Pretoria. Taki seems to have a very good representation on this panel. Now, after that very long introduction, I'm going to ask Linda to start sharing her screen with all of you. Thank you so much, everyone, and enjoy the webinar.
Good evening, everyone. Let me just share my screen. So I'm going to start tonight. I'm going to kick things off by just giving you a very brief overview of the research that BirdLife South Africa is currently doing into lead poisoning in vultures. As I'm sure most of you are aware, vultures are in peril. They're really not doing very well at all. We're 3 of the 9 vulture species in South Africa that are critically endangered, and that's actually 4 if you also take into account the bearded vulture, which is considered as regionally endangered. And the main reason for vulture declines in Africa is due to poisoning in its various forms. And that can either take the form of intentional poisoning, when when poachers lace carcasses with poison and poison hundreds of vultures at a time, or if birds are harvested for belief-based use, or unintentional poisoning when there are conflict between farmers and predators, and they poison the predators and the vultures get poisoned in turn. A topic that's received increased attention in recent years was lead poisoning, also an unintentional source of poisoning in vultures, and that's what I'm hoping to talk to you about tonight. So a couple of years ago, BirdLife South Africa set out to do a nationwide assessment of lead poisoning in South Africa's vultures to see what the extent of the problem is. And we collected bone and blood samples from most of the provinces in South Africa where vultures do occur. And I'm going to share those results with you now. Just a brief background, just some basic chemistry, if you will forgive me. The basic unit that you measure blood lead level in is called the microgram per deciliter. And basically all that is, a microgram is a millionth of a gram, and a deciliter is 100 milliliters. So it's just a little less than half a cup. And already that should give you some idea of how potent lead can be. So keeping that in mind, for our purposes tonight, anything under 10 micrograms per deciliter is generally regarded as background exposure. And what that means is it's not ideal. The lead is there, it's causing damage, but it's not enough to impact the day-to-day activity of the organism that is being affected. So keeping that in mind, I'm going to share with you some of the results that we found in white-back vultures. I'm going to keep back on the Cape vultures just for the sake of time. So in Hoedspruit, that is just near Kruger National Park, as most of you know, we found the average to be 14.7, and the highest there was in a chick, it was 47 micrograms per deciliter, and we found that 66% of the birds that we sampled were over 10 micrograms per deciliter. We then moved down to Zululand, where in Shihlui in Physiology Park, we found an average of 23.1. One bird had a blood lead level of close to 135 micrograms per deciliter, and 73% of the birds were over 10 micrograms per deciliter. So that was already upsetting, but when we then moved to Dronfield, where there's a very important white-back vulture breeding colony, we sampled over 2 years, I sampled about 85 white-back vulture chicks there, and we found that the average was 14.4. The highest in one chick was 85, and 64% of the birds were over 10 micrograms per deciliter. So we already knew there was a problem. But then great was my surprise when I actually went back there last year and realized that the problem had actually gotten worse. The average last year was 27.9. One poor chick had a blood level of 180 micrograms per deciliter. In fact, 7 of the chicks that I sampled were over 100 micrograms per deciliter, and all of the birds were over 10 micrograms per deciliter. So when you compare that to results that were from previous studies, Vinny Naidoo a couple of years ago looked at lead poisoning in Cape vultures and white-backed vultures. My results more or less agreed with what he achieved, and he reckoned that in Cape vultures about 55% of the birds were over 10 micrograms per deciliter. Becky Garbett also looked at lead poisoning in white-backed vultures in Botswana, and she found that lead poisoning in about 32% of the birds there. So already we can see that there seems to be a much bigger problem in South Africa than in our neighboring countries. And then also to look at another species, Sonia Kruger down in KZN, she also looked at bearded vultures, and she found similar results. She found very high bone lead levels in her bearded vultures that she sampled. So the next question that we have to ask, okay, so is this a vulture problem or is it a bird problem? So we then looked at a couple of other species, and I collected samples from a wide range of birds. I collected from gymnogene, secretary bird, Corey bustard, Lana falcon, Perry falcon, peregrine falcon, even the odd blue crane and a bunch of owls. And I couldn't find any elevated lead in any of those bird species. And that became quite clear if you put it on a very fancy graph. You can see clearly there that there's definitely a problem in our gyps vultures. I did manage to sample some lappet-faced vultures, but I only managed to sample about 6 birds, and that was definitely not enough to reach any kind of conclusion. But I think the graph there speaks it very plainly that gyps vultures, there's a massive problem. More than any other kind of large terrestrial bird species in South Africa, there is a problem with lead in our vultures. So where is this coming from? And this is the big question. So we needed to do a bit of deductive reasoning here. There's obviously something in their scavenging lifestyle that is predisposing them to lead poisoning, because we found that non-scavenging birds didn't have lead poisoning. They were only exposed to environmental lead. And by environmental lead, I mean the lead that all of us are exposed to. That's the lead that's in the dust, in the air, maybe in the water that we drink. The most interesting results were from the chicks, the lead poisoning that we found in the chicks. If their lead poisoning was purely from environmental sources, such as the dust or the air, we would have expected all of the chicks, especially at the Bromfield breeding colony, to have the same blood lead levels, but they didn't. Some of the birds were extremely high, some of them were in between, some of them had almost no lead in them. So that told us that, yes, there was environmental exposure, but that some of the chicks were receiving lead from some sort of external source. So these chicks are nest bound. They couldn't fly yet, they couldn't fend for themselves. So the only other possible source of lead that they could receive was from their parents. And that led us to conclude that the lead that was causing that incredibly high lead levels was coming from the food that is being fed to them by their parents. So if you keep in mind that in addition, those extremely high lead levels are probably caused by metallic lead fragments, that led us to conclude that this is probably in all likelihood caused by fragments of lead ammunition that is embedded in the food that these, or the carcasses that these parent vultures are feeding on. So if you look at this, this is a radiograph, or 2 radiographs that was taken of 2 different springbok ewes that were shot with lead core bullets. I put this in the slide because I just wanted to give you some sort of idea of what kind of fragmentation we're looking at when a lead bullet hits an animal. Vinny is going to talk to you about this in much more detail, but the smaller those fragments, the more likely they are to be absorbed into the bloodstream of an animal that ingests it. Vinny, as I said, will talk about this, but lead is dissolved very quickly in an acidic environment, and that facilitates its uptake. And as we know, vultures have incredibly acidic stomachs, which makes them even more vulnerable. So this is a typical scene that this picture I took in Zululand on a game ranch there. What farmers will do with the best of intentions. They will take gut piles or carcasses or leftovers, either from animals that have been culled or animals that have been hunted, and they would put it out at a special site for the scavengers to feed on. And this is brilliant because we need this food for these vultures. It's a reliable source of food for them, especially during breeding season where we know they need additional sources of food. But what is going wrong here is that carcasses are being put out that contain lead fragments, and then the birds feed on them, and not only do they get poisoned themselves, they also pass it on to their chicks. So we're looking at multiple sources. Even though we feel that lead ammunition itself is the culprit, we feel it's reaching the birds by various channels. It's coming through gut piles that are removed from animals, that are placed at vulture restaurants. Sometimes animals are culled because they're sick or lame, and then they're left for the vultures to feed on, and that is how the birds are being exposed. And it's for this reason that BirdLife South Africa is very passionate about promoting the use of lead-free ammunition. So before I pass things on to Vinny, I just want to give you some idea of the current research that I'm working on. At the moment, I'm looking at the sublethal effects of lead on vultures. We've already ascertained some of the physiological effects, and we've seen, especially in the chicks at Ronfield, that the lead in their systems are inhibiting their ability to manufacture heme. And as you know, heme is one of the key components in hemoglobin, and hemoglobin is the oxygen carrying molecule in the blood. So birds that are not able to manufacture heme may suffer from anemia. And that is not something that you want in a vulture chick that is about to fledge and about to face all sorts of anthropogenic threats. I'm also going to be looking at bone mineralization in these birds. We know that lead replaces calcium in the blood, in apatite, which is the main mineral component in bone. And I want to see if lead is making those bones more prone to fractures. We're also going to put some tracking devices on some of these chicks at Ronfield to see if there's any impact on their first year survival rate. And then finally, I'm going to look at some of the isotopes found in vulture blood, the lead isotopes, and see if that can tell me anything more about where this lead is coming from. So that is it from my side. I just want to take this opportunity. I know Pamela Isdale is watching, to thank Pamela and Neville Isdale, and as well as Jessica Slackdale from the Mary Oppenheimer and Daughters Foundation. They've supported my work over the last 2 or 3 years, and without them, this research would not have been possible. So I'm now going to pass it on to the brilliant and gifted Vinny Naidoo, who is my supervisor and in control of my academic future. So Vinny, you should have control of the screen now.
Thank you for that, Linda. Good afternoon, everybody, or good evening, depending where you are. So after that, I think Linda can pass. So let's see if I can take control. Here we go. So Linda's talk leads quite nicely into mine, and what she asked me to talk about is a bit on the physiology of lead, which is then the background effects of how lead is toxic. So the first question to ask is, what is lead? Now, lead, Pb or plumum, is atomic number 82, and it's an element, and it can occur in different isotopes from 204 onwards, as Linda said. However, lead is a bit more complicated than that, and you get a number of inorganic salts, which are things like lead oxide, sulfite, acetate, chromate, and chloride. But you also get organic lead, which is then the carbon-attached molecule, which is tetraethyl lead. And all of these different forms of lead create a different set of toxicity. And this is why lead toxicity is so complex, because you need to first try and find out which form of lead it is and how it gets into the body and how it causes toxicity. So where would we get lead from? Now, lead has been with us forever. In fact, there's a bit of an argument that says lead and people developed at the same time. So nowadays, you probably would find some lead in leaded pipes to all buildings. Although most of them have been replaced with now PVC pipes, they can still occur in all buildings. Lead used to be used as a sweetener in the form of lead acetate. And this is a form of lead that actually causes toxicity in animals. Because of its sweet taste, animals tend to eat it preferentially. Then you get leaded shot or bullets, which could be pure lead or could be an antimony alloy. Lead can be found in paints as pigment, such as lead chromate, which is your yellow pigment, lead oxide, which is red, and a number of other ones. All toys used to be made from lead. Then you get lead in soldering, lead in batteries as part of electrochemical cells, and then you get your tetraethyl lead, which is found in petrol. Tetraethyl lead was used in engines as anti-knock compound to reduce the knocking effect when the engine works and the wear on the engine. And tetraethyl lead is one of the major causes of lead toxicity worldwide for a number of decades. So to understand how lead is toxic, we first have to look at how lead gets into the body. Now up there, you have my depiction of a yellow Labrador. I do know he looks a bit funny, but that's the best I could draw him. Now, when you look at absorption, absorption tends to occur from three sites. You have the alimentary tract, the respiratory tract, or through the skin. Now, all these areas are physical barriers. So it actually separates the outside from the inside of the body. And if you look at the alimentary tract, it's actually one long tract, and you can see how anything inside the alimentary tract is outside the body. So the first thing that needs to happen is lead needs to go from outside to inside. And this is where it gets a bit complicated. So firstly, how do you get it in? Well, ingestion. This could be through contaminated plants growing on fields high in lead. And this typically happened near highways where you had leaded fuels and you had fumes deposited on the soil and that got accumulated in the plants. But it can be in water and other food sources. It could be through the ingestion of a bullet or a fragment of the bullet or through soil contaminated lead. You can get inhalation through industrial contamination, leaded fuels, and discharge from bullets. Now, discharge from bullets is a bit of an interesting one. This happens in hunters who fire a lot. And you get a bit of aerosolization of the lead, and over time you can get quite severe toxicity. And then you get one of the rarer forms, which is tissue absorption of lead. This typically happens when an animal or person gets shot with a pellet and the shot is left in the person. Now, typically it would encapsulate and you get poor absorption, but over time it can be absorbed. And in fact, being shot can lead to lead toxicity, which is more severe as a condition than the injury caused by the bullet. So just as a summary, this is the lead cycle and typically what's put forward for lead toxicity in people, and is equally applicable to all animals. So you have lead being aerosolized from petrols, cars, mining, industry. You get lead deposition, and it can bioaccumulate in animals or in plants or in water. And then you get exposure by ingestion, absorption, or inhalation. And the net effect is quite severe toxicity. So how does this toxicity work? Now, up here I have a simple diagram of the alimentary tract. You can see cells, which are the enterocytes, and then you have the inside, which is filled with fluid, typically water. So when any substance is ingested, say a tablet, it goes in as its larger size, but it then needs to go and break up, and that's where step 2, to smaller particles. Those smaller particles then go on to step 3, where it dissolves in the water phase. Step 4, it has to cross through the membrane of the cells and then get into the blood, which is then step 5. So all these processes together control the rate and extent in which a substance gets into the body. So if you control any of these, you can either increase or decrease absorption. As an example, rapid intestinal movement will get rid of a substance quickly, so you get less absorption. If a substance is large and gets stuck in the intestinal tract, it breaks down slowly and you get prolonged absorption. Likewise, if a substance is easily dissolved in the water phase, you'll get preferential absorption, and this can result in greater exposure. So using this principle, we can now look at how lead toxicity works. The first defining factor or feature of lead toxicity is the solubility of the lead. Lead solubility is greatest with tetraethyl lead, which is why leaded fuels were so dangerous. And as you go down your salts, you get decrease in the solubility until you get to elemental lead, which is poorly soluble. So all in all, the least likelihood of getting or being exposed to a toxin is through elemental lead. However, is also dependent on other factors such as getting stuck in the intestinal tract and rate of passage. So rate of passage. So lead is preferentially absorbed in an acidic environment. And of all the leads, lead acetate was best absorbed. But game meat, which is or has fragments of bullets prepared with vinegar, we do know has preferential absorption of that lead. When you look at the pH, in birds, there's different pHs of the GIT. The crop has the highest pH of 6 to 7, and the stomach has the lowest of 2 to 4. So from this, you can see that preferential absorption will occur from the GIT, or at least from the stomach in the GIT. So the longer a bullet stays in the GIT, in specifically the stomach, the better absorption you get. And this is where consumption of a bullet can cause a problem. That large bullet fragment can get stuck in the pylorus and you can get slower absorption, while your smaller particles can pass through rapidly and sometimes get out quickly. So up here, I have an F radiograph. It's one of the radiographs you can find commonly on the internet. And in here, you can see a pellet, and that is actually sitting in the pylorus. You can see it's large, it won't pass through, and that fragment or bullet has to erode slowly, and that lead then gets time to get absorbed. And this is why you end up with chronic toxicity for the consumption of a single bullet, and why individual animals can have higher levels than other birds that are in a similar environment. The next thing is bullet fragmentation. Now, Linda showed you some pictures. So this is a radiograph that was taken in the States. And you can see the large number of fragments that can occur. And in this case, it was on a thoracic shot, and that is in the intercostal space. So those fragments, because they've broken down, they're large particles, go into smaller particles, and in the intestinal tract, you can get preferential absorption purely because of the volume. So it's a simple principle: larger surface area, better absorption. And this goes one step further, and this is known as nanoparticle lead. This is very small particles at the nano level, and bullets are known to fragment to the nano level, and you can't really see them, they're so tiny. However, they are very dangerous because these are easily absorbed by the GIT, and they're absorbed by a different process from what I've just described. It gets absorbed by a process known as pinocytosis, or phagocytosis if you prefer. This is where the cell invaginates around the molecule and preferentially takes it in. And nanoparticle lead, because of this, can cause severe toxicity and is very dangerous. So just to summarize, the effect of size: large fragments will break down slowly and get absorbed slower in time, so you get slow chronic toxicity. Smaller fragments are absorbed more rapidly, giving you faster toxicity, but you also get quicker excretion. Nanoparticles absorb very rapidly and very quick to toxicity. So what happens to lead when it gets into the body? So after absorption, it gets into the body, and this is a typical kinetic illustration. What is listed there as CC stands for central compartment, and that refers to the body itself. So in the body, it distributes into your two areas: your well-perfused areas and your poorer perfused areas. Your well-perfused areas are typically your liver, kidney, and in blood, the actual enterocytes, where lead accumulates inside the cell. Here it can stay for up to 30 days and can cause severe tissue damage. The more chronic form of lead occurs when it goes into your poorer perfused tissues, being bone. And this is where it binds to your calcium phosphate apatite, replacing calcium, and it can stay in that bone for up to 30 years. And when bone breaks down, lead can get mobilized and you can get toxicity. That type of toxicity has been described in postmenopausal women when you have bone breakdown due to hormonal change. And even though exposure has been many decades ago, you can get resumption of toxicity at a later stage. Now this is an X-ray, and it shows a lead line. And this is where lead has preferentially accumulated in the growth plates, and these are the arrows, in bones of children. And you can see how the lead replaces calcium and actually goes into the bone stores. So what do we get with lead toxicity? Now, lead toxicity is typically divided into acute and chronic. Acute lead toxicity occurs when a predefined blood level is exceeded. And you typically see blood abnormalities because, as Linda said, it interferes with the heme synthesis, and that leads to a lower red cell count or hematocrit. It can cause also severe liver and kidney damage, and it can cause reproductive disorders. And this is typically seen as embryonic or fetal toxicity. So you will see abnormal chick development in the egg. Chronic toxicity tends to occur over a longer period of time, and this is when the buffering capacity of the body is exceeded. So the body can no longer take lead into the bone, and it can occur when you also have mobilization of those calcium stores. The clinical signs may be similar to the acute sign because you have rapid increase in lead, but it can also be due to other physiological factors. The first one is bone abnormalities, and this is because it interferes with all the bone cells, from your chondrocytes to your lining cells. And it also then interferes with vitamin D directly. And what happens is the lead actually takes the same pathways as calcium. And in the brain, in neural tissue, where calcium is very important for nerve conduction, you also then end up with abnormal nerve function. And this is typically seen as weakness and hallucinations. If you see an animal with chronic lead toxicity, you tend to get two common sides. They have what we call stargazing and fly biting. Stargazing is where they look into space with a blank expression on their face. They have no idea where they are. And fly biting is they look like they're attacking imaginary flies. Very typical for lead toxicity. There's some suggestion that lead could be carcinogenic, specifically in people, although this is not completely proven as yet. So this is an X-ray we took from a Vulture check, just to illustrate the bone abnormalities that can happen. So on the left, with the open arrow, you can see a fracture on the wing where you have complete bending of the bone. On the right, the solid large arrow shows the thin cortices in the femur. And then you also have the wing with a small arrow showing typical folding fractures. So all in all, the bone is no longer structurally sound, and as the muscles contract, which now have developed preferentially and well compared to the bone can't handle the mechanical forces and they collapse on itself. So what levels are toxic? Now, Linda touched on this already. So the first thing is background exposure. Because lead has been present in the environment for years, either from release in mines, from petrol, from other activities, you will get exposure to lead quite often. And it's not harmful, but it's present in everybody. So it's a bit of a debate what levels should be used. Some say less than 20 micrograms per deciliter. Others say less than 10 micrograms per deciliter. In my experience, it's very unlikely that you get 10 anymore because these are your typical pristine sites. Subclinical toxicity occurs when the animal itself looks clinically healthy, but you have physiological changes, and typically you'll see reproductive and embryotoxic changes. And here you're looking at levels at around 20 to 50 micrograms per deciliter in the blood. Overtoxicity occurs with clinical signs, and that's when you have levels above 50. It's very unusual to have an animal with above 100 that survives for very long. Levels above 100 are usually fatal. So in conclusion, it is a very complex subject because of the absorptive profile, and it really depends on species, age, and type. Clinical signs, neurological signs are what's most commonly seen clinically. And your source of exposure, as Linda said, it can be large group exposure, then you actually look at a common environmental source, or it could be single animal exposure, where you're looking at single exposure such as a bullet. And that is where I would end.
Thanks very much, Linda, and thanks, Vinny, for making a very complex subject so understandable and so entertaining. So really, thank you so much for those two presentations. Great. So my name is Ian Rushworth. I work for Ezemvelo KZN Wildlife, but this evening I'm speaking to you in my capacity as the current chairperson of the National Lead Task Team. When we were invited to give these presentations, we were asked to provide a photo. So I provided this photo. But as my colleagues were quick to point out, my hair nowadays is a lot grayer than that. So this is clearly an older photo. But the reason I chose this photo is because this was the day and the place where I first became aware of the issue of lead toxicity in wildlife. This was at the Grand Canyon in 2006. And on that, shortly after that photo was taken, I met with a National Park Service ranger who was talking to me about the concerns they had with the California condor reintroduction program and the problems that they were experiencing with condors being poisoned by lead fragments from bullets in their food. She also introduced me to the idea of lead-free ammunition that they were encouraging landowners and hunters to use. So I immediately started wondering about lead exposure in African vultures and in African wildlife in general. And so while this trip here was the end of my journey for that particular trip in the States, it was the beginning of my journey in terms of lead in wildlife in South Africa. And so while Linda's spoken about a very important guild of birds, the vultures, and the impacts of lead there, I just wanted to start by talking about another study that's been undertaken in KwaZulu-Natal, looking at crocodiles. And so this study looked at crocodiles in northeastern KwaZulu-Natal and found very high levels of lead in crocodiles, particularly in the males, where the levels were nearly, or on average, 100 micrograms per deciliter. So remember, Vinny was saying over 100, you tend to die for most species. And 11 out of 18 crocodiles at St. Lucia had blood lead levels greater than 20 micrograms per deciliter. But one individual had a level of 960 micrograms per deciliter. So that animal, in terms of current thinking, should have been dead a long time ago, but it was still foraging, still moving around, and apparently not obviously ill. And then, so it's obviously crocodiles are sort of slightly more tolerant to lead than most other groups of vertebrates. However, there's a major concern about reproduction and the impact of this lead on egg production and the developing embryos in their nests, and possibly that might explain why the reproductive rate of those crocodiles in that system is relatively low, and might also explain why the lead levels in females is lower than in males, because they might be mobilizing some of that lead into egg production. So what is the source of this lead? So all 8 crocodiles that were dissected during the course of that study had lead sinkers in their stomachs. And those lead sinkers are all from recreational fishing in the St. Lucia estuary. And through a process of elimination, the authors basically discounted other sources of lead. So whether it was from the soil, whether it was from shooting, because obviously it's inside a World Heritage Site, there's no shooting taking place, and mining and industrial pollution are also discounted. So in that case, there's a pretty strong case to show that the sinkers that were in the stomachs were actually the cause of the high blood lead levels in the animals. But the next slide, when it does appear, will just show a photo of a crocodile stomach. And what you'll notice in there, there's a lot of rocks. So they ingest a lot of rocks to help, it's thought to help with buoyancy, but also to help with digesting the food. But at the same time, they are ingesting other objects and lead sinkers. It's not known whether they select the sinkers off the muddy floor of the estuary, or whether those are ingested as a result of theft of fishing baits, or both. But that's what they look like. And because the stomach is so acidic, that lead is then broken down and absorbed. All right. So Linda's study has given some quite strong evidence that lead bullets were the likely source of lead in vultures, and the crocodile study has fairly strong evidence that fishing sinkers were the source of lead. But there are many other sources, potential sources of lead, direct and indirect sources in wildlife. And when my slide appears, you'll see what some of those are. So what we tried to do through the work of the lead task team is list some of those sources. And here are some of them that we've identified, sources of lead for wildlife, for exposure of wildlife. The size of the circle doesn't indicate the importance or the magnitude of the impact, but they're all shown in the same sort of size. And then once you can identify the potential sources of lead, you can also look at the possible mechanisms of that getting then into wildlife from those sources. And there are multiple mechanisms relating to each of those potential sources. All right. So, for example, with bullets, a farmer might shoot a sick cow and then take it to a vulture restaurant to feed, and then that's how vultures might become exposed. In wildlife management, there's many sources of lead, including problem animal control, culling, poachers obviously using lead. Wildlife managers are often shooting animals to feed predators and scavengers. Hunting is an obvious source of lead into the environment, as are the military and the police, who discharge a lot of lead. But a number of those sources, now covered in the green plasters, are now relatively well controlled through legislation, and will largely be sort of historical sources of lead, and we probably don't need to worry about them too much going forward. But things like fishing sinkers, batteries, possibly wheel balancing weights, possibly avgas, industrial pollution, mining, and lead-based bullets remain the largest sort of unregulated source of lead going into the environment, and will probably be the main sources of lead for exposure of wildlife. Then there have been not that many studies done in Southern Africa, but there are an increasing number of studies that are looking at lead in wildlife, and we've spoken about 2 of them already. And so in terms of fishing sinkers, we had that crocodile study. There have been studies looking at lead along the highways that Vinny mentioned, and that lead then goes into the vegetation, and then that can go into animals. There is an example of vultures in captivity being poisoned from the paint, on the lead-based paint in their cages. And there's now four studies looking at vultures that have implicated bullets as a potential source of lead. There's one study that's where 2 cheetah died after being fed meat shot with lead containing bullets. There's 2 cases of ground hornbills being poisoned, one where food was shot with a shotgun, and another case where a hornbill ingested a bullet from gravel that had bullets from a shooting range. And there's at least 2 cases of cranes being poisoned, one case of cranes picking up lead-containing bullets at an outdoor shooting range, and another case recently in the Midlands of KwaZulu-Natal, where we're not sure what the source of lead was, but it's definitely a sort of a mineral source of lead, because the blood lead levels were very high at the time of death. So, obviously you identified the sources of lead in wildlife, but just to mention that lead is a massive issue for humans also. There's a number of organizations like the World Health Organization that have identified lead as one of the top 10 minerals of concern or poisons of concern. And so they've estimated a large number of human deaths per year caused by lead, and a large number of people have their IQ, especially children, have their IQ affected for life through exposure to lead. Why don't you just go up one slide? And the economists are able to put a value to that, and they sort of estimate that the impact of that lead exposure from multiple sources is over $1 trillion, and a large part of that burden is from low to middle income countries. They're disproportionately represented. So both the World Health Organization and the United Nations Environment Assembly have identified lead as a problem and require countries to take measures to deal with it. As part of that, the South African government has recently approved a national lead exposure prevention strategy that identifies potential sources of lead. It's putting a bit more focus on removing the remaining sources of lead from paint. And there's a number of communication and awareness and research components to that strategy. All right, next slide. And there's an increasing number of multilateral environmental agreements that are highlighting the issue of lead, and in particular lead from bullets as a potential source of environmental problems. And so some of those conventions include the Convention on the Conservation of Migratory Species, the Raptors MOU, and the Vulture Multi-Species Action Plan, and various other conventions. The IUCN has also, in 2016, passed a resolution 82 promoting the phasing out of lead shot for hunting over wetlands and areas where scavengers feed a lot and may be exposed to lead-based ammunition. The interesting thing was the level of support for that resolution, and I think the high levels of support that were gained both from governments and from NGOs is relating to the large amount of evidence that's now available to show that lead, and in particular lead bullets, are a concern to wildlife and the environment. All right, so we're going to then just talk about the lead task team now. So given all of these concerns and these international agreements, the South African government isn't sitting back and doing nothing. So the South African government, through the National Department of Environment, Forestry and Fisheries, has established a lead task team to really look into some of these issues. So it was established at the end of last year with the mission to make recommendations and support implementation of processes within government, wildlife sector and other relevant stakeholders towards achieving the vision to ensure that wildlife in South Africa is not harmed by exposure to lead. Currently, we have membership from national government, provincial government, hunting and angling associations, conservation NGOs, academics, and recently we're bringing on more youth, because they are the future of taking this forward once the older generation move on. So there are a number of objectives of the task team that I'm not going to go through in too much detail, other than to say that the task team is required to identify and describe potential sources and risks of lead to wildlife, and look at potential interventions, to identify information gaps and develop a research program, to provide policy and management guidelines for government, industry and landowners for avoiding or minimizing the exposure of wildlife to lead, and active engagement with affected parties to understand their position and concerns regarding lead. So that's a very important part of the process of engagement and dealing with stakeholders. The lead task team is also responsible for developing a monitoring framework to monitor trends in lead exposure in wildlife, and to provide assistance to the department with reporting on some of those international agreements. And there's certain principles that are ingrained in the way that the lead task team works. The first is that we work with scientific evidence, and so that all the advice and policy recommendations that we make are based on evidence, and that we'll also look at all sources of lead exposure. Importantly, we'll work together with all stakeholders in an inclusive process of consultation that aims to focus on finding common ground and solutions. And so we're doing quite a detailed process of identifying all the stakeholders. We're also going to consider the implications or unintended consequence of any recommendations, and establish various subcommittees that will look in more detail at various technical aspects that need to be looked at. And even though the task team is quite young, we've already produced a best practice guideline for recognizing and treating lead toxicosis in wild birds. And as soon as that's approved, that will be available to veterinarians and rehab facilities. We're working on a lead monitoring framework, and I think probably fairly uniquely in the world, we're aiming to do a pre-intervention as well as post-intervention monitoring to track trends in lead exposure across a range of wildlife taxa, to see how things change over time, but also to evaluate the effectiveness of any interventions that are put in place. And we're using proper statistical methods to determine the right sample sizes to be able to do that. We are in the process of developing research priorities in relation to lead, and to fast track knowledge generation, and we will develop an action plan during the course of this year to take us forward for the next 5 years. Just two last little examples before I sum up. And a number of conservation agencies are taking measures to reduce their exposure of lead into the environment. So Ezemvelo KZN Wildlife is in the process of transitioning to lead-free ammunition for culling. And while that process is still taking place, there's a process to remove the heads of any animals that are shot with headshots, or to remove enough tissue from around any body shots, and to remove that and make sure that those carcasses don't contain lead if they're put out for scavengers. And the material that's removed is then disposed of in a way that is not available to mammalian or avian scavengers either. Any culling tenders for culling in protected areas requires the use of lead-free ammunition, and we're very careful about accepting any animals to vulture restaurants from other sources. If they have been shot with lead-containing bullets, we either don't accept them or make sure that the lead is removed from the carcass. And some of our protected areas have started culling with lead-free ammunition. And I must say that the managers who've done that have been very impressed with the performance of that ammunition. And this year we'll be moving to more lead-free ammunition for culling in protected areas. I must also just note that the Eastern Cape Parks and Tourism Agency have also taken steps to reduce the amount of lead that they're discharging into their protected areas. So the last initiative I just wanted to quickly talk about is Vulture Safe Zone. So this is something that is being promoted by BirdLife. And one of the requirements to become a vulture safe zone for areas of high importance for vultures is a requirement to transition to lead-free ammunition for culling and hunting. And the second vulture safe zone that will be established in South Africa is in the Zululand area. And there all the landowners have committed to make sure that all culling and hunting going forward in this entire area will be done with lead-free ammunition. And so I think that's a fantastic initiative that I'd like to applaud. And I think now that the lockdown regulations are allowing us to travel a bit, I'd really encourage anyone that's planning holidays to support places like this that are doing the responsible thing and taking steps to ensure the safety of vultures. With a little bit of effort and leadership, and they've managed to find or negotiate rates for lead-free ammunition at the same price or even cheaper than normal lead-based ammunition available from local retailers. So when people want to do it, they can do it. So just before I hand over, I just wanted to summarize and say that, you know, if we acknowledge that lead is a threat to wildlife, if we take responsibility for our unintended harm to the environment, and if we can communicate and work together on finding solutions, then I'm very confident that we can get to the point where our use of wildlife and the environment can genuinely be called sustainable, and we can avoid unnecessary harm to wildlife. So with that, I'd like to hand over to Lizanne Nel. Lizanne Nel is the Conservation Manager of SA Hunters and Game Conservation Association, and Lizanne is going to talk about some hunters' perspectives relating to lead in wildlife.
Good evening, everybody. To start with, I'm just quickly going to talk about, just introduce you to SA Hunters. It's an organization of about 43,000 members, and it represents the interest of consumptive hunters. The members of SA Hunters, they live off the land either as hunters that hunt free-range protein or as owners of game farms. And conservation and responsible wildlife use is really at the heart of SA Hunters. The organization was established in 1949 specifically for the purpose of conservation of wildlife, promoting the interests of responsible hunters. Now, if you look at the conservation contribution of hunters, I'm going to try and rush through this a bit to save some time. You'll see that there's about 250,000 hunters in South Africa, of which 43,000 are members of SA Hunters. The contribution of hunters to the economy, the meat hunting sector is about 11.6 billion, while international hunting is about 2.1 billion. Around about 50% of expenses of hunting is paid for the game that are hunted, and this serves as an incentive for species and habitat conservation that contributes to about 70 million hectares being conserved as wildlife ranches. This is about 2 times bigger than protected areas in South Africa. Now, for 30% of those game ranches, hunting is the most important income, while more than 50% of them depend on hunting as an income to be viable. Hunting also plays an important role in food security, and it's estimated that red meat sales drop in the hunting season with about 20%. However, there are increasingly, with time, questions asked about the impact of lead from hunters. Now, if I can summarize the hunter's perspective, is there's an acknowledgement of hunters that there is a substantive evidence base on the risk of lead for people and wildlife associated with lead. There's also an awareness that there's a perception that the use of lead-based hunting bullets causes lead poisoning in raptors. The substantive evidence on research in South Africa linking hunting specifically to these poisoning incidents is, however, limited. There is an acknowledgement that lead ammunition from various sources might contribute to poisoning incidents. Mitigation measures should, however, be very specific and not a one-size-fits-all approach. And we need an holistic approach considering various sources of lead and the associated impacts on people and wildlife. Now, despite the fact that some of the hunters still have challenges in understanding all of the impacts around lead ammunition, hunters are committed, and specifically in SA Hunters, the organization has taken the lead, and we are participating in various of the forums related to lead. We are collaborating with conservation organizations as well as other hunting organizations. SA Hunters is a member of the IUCN, but we also sit on this National Poison Prevention Working Group. We sit on the Vulture task team as well as this lead task team. We support open and robust communication to improve a mutual understanding of the challenges. And I can assure you that on the lead task team, there are quite robust discussions on lead and the impacts of lead. As far as research are concerned, we believe that we should, as a collective, identify the research gaps. But what is also important is that that research must be translated in a format that stakeholders can understand that. As researchers, we often develop the results, but we don't translate that into a format that stakeholders can digest easily. Then awareness raising is critically important on the risks and viable mitigation measures. And there, SA Hunters has got a local and an international network where we engage with several other organizations on lead-related issues. And then on alternatives, I'll touch on that just in one of the next slides. And then it's also important for us to be involved in conservation efforts. So as far as understanding, I saw that there were some questions about the lead ammunition. I just want to touch on a few aspects quickly. When you consider a bullet choice, there's a couple of issues that you need to consider. The first is animal welfare and human safety. So in choosing your ammunition, it's important to make sure that you have a quick kill for the sake of the animal. Now, often with soft ammunition like lead, for instance, there's a lot of tissue damage. So you might get animals dying quickly, while with solid ammunition, you might actually, it's important to, if you have thick-skinned animals, to use something like that to reach the vitals. But it can result in safety issues if you have over-penetration. And I'll show you some of the bullets a bit later to clarify that. Then availability for the various calibers is an important issue. Pricing is an issue. And then also environmental risk and exposure. For instance, on a shooting range, you have a contained area where you shoot, let's say, for sport shooting, while in wildlife management, it's an impact over large areas. And then in self-defense, you would need a soft bullet because you would like to have a quick impact on short distance. So all of those issues play a role in choosing which bullet you're going to use. This picture gives you an indication of types of bullets. So on the left, you have monolithic bullets. So these are what people call solids. It's mostly of copper, made out of copper or alloys thereof. And you can see that this is what I call a solid. So this would leave a very small track through an animal, while with the newer developments, you can see that some of the lead, some of the copper bullets do expand, so they have a higher impact. On this side, where you have copper ammunition, you see there's high weight retention, so there's very few particles that break off, while on this side we have lead core bullets with the copper jacket, and you can see here, so they mushroom, so they cause a lot of damage when they go into the animal, but you have lower weight retention, meaning that there's a lot of particles that can stay behind in the animal, and we saw some of that pictures earlier. As far as ammunition and alternatives, here you can see this is alternative bullets available in South Africa. Here we start with lead core bullets, and here we move to monometal expanding bullets, and you can see this is the prices just for the tip. So compared to the standard lead core bullet, you can see here what is the factor increase. So it's not that much more expensive than a standard lead core bullet. So, and it is available in South Africa. You can see here local and important. However, we have serious challenges when we get to lead shot ammunition. So here you can see the shot shell ammunition. This is a standard lead shot and the price in South Africa. Now, all of the alternatives for lead shot is imported, and you can see here none of it is currently available in South Africa. If you look at the factor increase over lead shot, you can see here 14 to 22, so it's quite expensive. Bismuth is currently the one with the most reasonable price, and this is before being imported into South Africa. So we really have a challenge as far as shot shell ammunition is concerned to look at alternatives in South Africa. SA hunters, however, have successfully started collaboration with manufacturers of bullets and ammunition to develop lead-free local alternatives. We are currently testing some of that in collaboration with conservation agencies, and we are glad to mention that 2% of the sale of that lead-free ammunition will go into our conservation trust fund, which will be used for relevant research in this regard. So, as far as SA hunters education and training is concerned, quite a big effort is going into training and educating our hunters. And We have a monthly organized shooting events for members to improve their accuracy and skill, and through that reduce risks of wounded animals. Our shooting ranges the impact is contained on the shooting ranges, so all shooting ranges are fenced and they're also certified. And in that there's a risk management as far as lead is concerned. Then as far as information on health, members are informed of the health risks. Our shooting ranges are also open shooting ranges and not closed shooting ranges. And we give advice as far as game meat processing is concerned. And then especially also we do donations of game meat for Vulture restaurants. There's a safety protocol that is developed with Vulpro that we advise members on if they've used lead shot to not donate those carcasses to Vulture restaurants. As far as risk management are concerned while hunting, members are also advised on how to deal with gut piles when they've hunted with lead ammunition to reduce possible risks for scavengers. We have a policy regarding shooting over wetlands and water bodies. Lead shot should not be used, and alternatives should be used, or they should avoid shooting over wetland bodies altogether. And then we have 2 magazines, and in those magazines we also have articles and information where we give advice to our members. Then lastly, I just quickly want to touch on our Vulture Heritage program. So we've developed a program where our hunters, when they are in the field, they can start gathering information on vultures and other rare and threatened species. It's being translated into an app that they can use on their phones. So if they see any vultures in the field, the information is captured, and this information will then be transferred to the relevant conservation agencies. We also have some of our branches have initiatives around some of the vulture restaurants where they support those restaurants. They put up some of those poles that the vultures can sit on. They do monitoring at these vulture restaurants, and they also participate in some of the rescue operations. So if there are vultures that have been poisoned or vultures that have flown into or shocked with the electricity, and the rehabilitation centers can't get to those vultures immediately, we assist and we contain those animals until they can arrive to deal with those specific animals. Yes, some of the work where we have discussions with Eskom around the electricity pylons. We do similar work for our conservation, and then in some of the areas, on the protected areas, if there's challenges with water provision, here we are sponsoring solar panels for water pumps in areas where, in drought, where there's not water available. And then we also have educational programs for the youngsters and for kids to raise awareness on aspects of environmental poisoning and conservation. So in conclusion, I just want to say that SA Hunters is really committed, and we've got demonstrated leadership and dealing with some of the difficult conservation challenges in South Africa. We do believe it's a process, and in this process we need everybody's buy-in. The hunters, the conservationists, the ammunition manufacturers, government, all of us have a role to play. It's our wildlife, and all of us have a responsibility to play a role. Thank you so much.
Thank you very, very much, Lizanne, Vinny, Linda, and Ian. That was absolutely fascinating and a really interesting range of perspectives on this really important and exciting topic. So thank you all for giving up your Tuesday nights to join us. I really do appreciate it. I'm going to ask all of our speakers just to put their videos on for this next session, where we're going to handle a few questions. Thank you all. I can see you all there. And just before we kick off into the questions, I'd like to remind everyone that as you're exiting the webinar tonight, you will get a small survey popping up in your browser as you leave. There are some questions pertaining to tonight's lead webinar, so please do take the time to answer those. It does help us with our lead work going forward. So thank you to those of you who have completed it already and continue to complete them each week. Just before we get into questions as well, a reminder that next week Dr. Warwick Tarberton and Fani du Plessis will be coming onto the webinar to talk to us about 20 years of the Nailsflay woodland bird census. And that's going to be a fascinating look at some of the long-term trends of woodland birds in Limpopo. So be sure to tune in for that one next week, and we'll also be announcing those prize winners of our various competitions. Now, we've got about 15 minutes before we dive into the end of our webinar series, so I'm going to get right into them, and I'm going to kick off with Linda first for this one. Andre van der Westhuizen has asked, what is the percentage of vulture mortality due to lead from ammunition compared to other poisoning, such as organophosphates or other poisons? In other words, how many vultures are dying from lead ammunition compared to other causes?
I think that's a brilliant question, and it comes up a lot. And I think the point that Andre is trying to make is that hundreds of vultures die from organophosphate poisoning. There's no denying that. However, the vulture mortality is due to lead is not really directly to lead. It's not really what's concerning me. What's concerning me is the impact that lead is having on their predisposition to be prone to other anthropogenic threats. So we know that lead is a non-specific poison. It affects every organ system in the body, specifically the neurological system. We're only beginning to understand the impact that it is having on vultures. We've already demonstrated that it's compromising a chick's ability to manufacture hemoglobin, which makes them prone to anemia. So those birds are going to fletch. We know for large raptors, their highest rates of mortality is during their first year of life, under the best of circumstances. Now they're fledging with a significant body burden of lead, and they're already on the back foot. Other studies have shown that lead is having impact on birds' reproductive system. It affects their skeleton. Because it affects their neurological system, is it making them more prone to collisions with power infrastructure? These are questions that we still need to answer. And to answer Andre's question, no, we don't know the impact or the level, the percentage of birds that die because of lead poisoning. But in my mind, that's actually beside the point. We know it may not be as severe. It may not kill 100 birds at a time. In my mind, I don't think that is the case. For that reason, I'm saying that lead toxicity is a matter of conservation concern.
Thank you very much for that answer. The next one I'm going to put is for Prof Naidoo. John Lombard is asking, can lead poisoning be treated or alleviated in birds and wildlife?
Yeah, so it's definitely treatable. So if you do catch a bird with lead, you can treat them with, there are quite a few compounds. Calcium EDTA is commonly used, but you can use penicillamine. And what these compounds do is they are chelating agents. They pull lead into the blood, bind them chemically, and they can be excreted in the kidneys. So if you catch a bird in time, you can treat it. The problem is finding them. And you also need to take them into a hospital environment because they need to be treated for a few days. Typically, you go for 5 days. But the other problem you have is, and this is a study we've done at the National Zoo, the lead that gets mobilized quickly can get out of the body, but you still have lead bound in the bone, and that can be released at a later point. So it's always advisable to treat the bird a few weeks later. So if you're not under hospitalized conditions, it's extremely difficult to manage these birds. So realistically, the best way to stop lead poisoning is to treat in the first place.
Thanks so much, Vinny. We've got quite a number of questions asking about the replacements of these lead bullets. So Lizanne, if I may, a couple of people are asking, in terms of these suitable alternatives, is the price a really big factor in how people perceive moving to these alternatives? And are we able to source these bullets within South Africa? Is there a possibility that we could manufacture them ourselves instead of importing them?
Thanks, Melissa. Yeah, as mentioned, as far as the bullets are concerned, we have engaged some of the manufacturers, and there's a number of South African alternatives. The challenge we have is with the lead shot shell. At the moment, there's no South African manufacturers, but we are engaging with international counterparts to see whether we can either do bulk import of alternatives or to find solutions, because that is quite a big challenge. And I think that's why, as part of the lead task team, we also decided that we have to engage the manufacturers of ammunition as part of this process, because they have to help us find solutions in some of these areas.
Thank you so much, Lizanne. The next question is going to be for Ian, and this comes from Robin Helenor. Ian, they're asking, many families in South Africa consume large quantities of venison, often hunted by themselves. Have there been any studies commissioned to look at lead levels of these families? And do we know if consuming large quantities of venison has been an issue for people?
Okay, so in South Africa, as far as I'm aware, there hasn't been much done in the way of this. Overseas, there's been much more work done, and there are publications out there to show that hunters and their families can have elevated levels of lead in their blood and in their bodies. So it is something that I think people that are consuming game meat shot with lead-based ammunition should be concerned about. I think it's something that we do need to look at in a South African context. I think, as Vinny mentioned, sometimes in the preparation of the meat, particularly when you're making biltong and you're adding vinegar, it does make the lead more available. What I'm particularly concerned about and would like for us to study and look into is particularly the skinners and the other staff that are involved in butchering the carcasses, who are often given offcuts and the heart and the lungs and the brains and parts of the body like that may well have higher levels of lead than the normal meat that the hunter may take with them. So I think that's an area that we definitely need to look at, and that goes for on farms, but also in conservation areas where culling is done, and staff sometimes are sold some of the meat or given some of the meat from those culls. So it's definitely an area I think we need to look at. At the end of the day, switching to lead-free ammunition would solve that problem in its entirety. But before that's a viable option, or in the absence of that, then we just need to take more thought about how we butcher the carcasses and which meat we use and how we use it. Thanks.
Thanks so much, Ian. We've got a question on Facebook, and I think I'm going to start off with Linda on this one. This is from Heron, and he's asking, copper is a replacement for lead in bullets, but do we have any idea what the effect of copper is on birds or animals as well as humans?
That is a very good question, and copper is actually also a heavy metal, and it can also be toxic in large quantities. There has been a couple of studies done, to my knowledge. I'm not too knowledgeable on the subject about the toxicity of copper to birds. However, to my knowledge, it's not as severe as it is in lead. I may want to ask Vinny to just maybe supplement my question on that as well.
Vinny, please go for it.
Hopefully my internet is stable enough this time. So copper is probably less toxic than lead. It comes down to the absorption criteria, but you do get severe liver damage with copper. It is specifically toxic to the hepatocytes, and you can get quite severe liver failure in following exposure to copper.
Thanks, Vinny. While I've got you on the podium, I'm going to fire one your way as well. So Dale's asking... Yes.
Sorry to interrupt. I just want to add something there. And one thing that maybe also be worth considering is that when it comes to a copper bullet will not fragment as much as a lead bullet. So the risk of there'll not be as many fragments to ingest, so the risk may be lower. That's the point I'm trying to make.
Thanks, Linda. We're getting a question here talking about the environmental exposure. So looking at several SA mines which produce lead concentrates, and obviously some of this is being exported through the likes of Saldanha and potentially spilling over from railway lines and possibly even into river systems and the sea. And do we know of any sort of good cases of this environmental exposure where we might be seeing higher levels of lead being detected through other industries?
To be honest, that's not something we had yet considered when we were sort of looking at the potential sources of lead into the environment. So thank you for that hint. We'll look into that. I would imagine, you know, even with coal on trains, there's always some level of exposure or materials sort of leaving the carriages. So it could well be something to look at. Yeah, the question would be, how far does it move in the environment once it's there? If it gets into the soil, if it gets into rivers, you know, how far could it move and what could it impact? Certainly with roads, you know, there's very good evidence of when there was lead in fuel of lead contamination of areas surrounding the roads and extending some distance away from the roads. And that included contamination of people who live near roads, as well as people that run, and so on, who are breathing in a lot of that lead during the time when we had lead in fuel. So that certainly is a well-established source. Yeah, general mining, dust from some of the mines, some of the uranium mines can move quite far. So in the wind, and then there's deposited. So some of the copper mines have lead or uranium associated with them. So that's the source in Zambia. Maybe places like Palabora, we're not sure. So mining certainly is a source. And then through some industrial processes, it can get into the atmosphere and be deposited quite far away. So for example, in the Drakensberg, we're finding quite a lot of deposition of stuff that starts up in Gauteng or in Mpumalanga Highveld, gets carried by the upper winds and then is deposited in the rain over the Drakensberg. So far, the levels of lead in that seem to be relatively low, but it is something we need to look at as a potential source of general environmental contamination. So, but anyway, thanks for the heads up on the train.
Thanks very much for that one, Ian. We've got a question here from Asher saying that Asher's a young adult in Joburg, and this is obviously quite an overwhelming thing to talk about. And Asher wants to know, is there something that Asher as a young adult could do in Johannesburg to help with the challenges around lead? And Linda, I wonder if you have any sort of advice for the common man or woman out there, what they could potentially do to help with mitigating lead impacts on not just wildlife, but society at large.
Sure, thanks for that, Zinger. Well, in terms of an urban environment, you know, I think the current risks with legislation in place in terms of lead is rather low. As part of my study, I had my own blood levels tested. I needed a blood sample, and I thought, what the hell, okay, I'll just get it for myself. And I had very low lead levels, and I was born and raised in Joburg. So with the regulation of leaded fuel and all of that, the risk to humans in terms of an urban environment is quite low. It's really the best advice I can give you is that if you are interested in hunting and that is your pastime, consider using lead-free ammunition. That is the biggest gift I think that you can give the environment at this stage. If you are a fisherman and that is your bent, consider using lead-free sinkers. I think it's important to consider in every action that we as humans take now is to consider what impact your action can possibly have on the environment moving forward.
Thanks for that, Linda. And I think that's really sage advice. I am cognizant of time. I'm going to run about 5 minutes over just because we've got a lot of really good questions here. Vinny, I wonder if I can put this one to you, and I hope the internet will hold this time. But Donnie's asking if it's possible to identify birds that may have been poisoned by lead by taking photos of them. So are you able to detect some level of lead exposure through photographs? And I wonder if you don't mind just stepping in there while Vinny's connection catches up with us.
The short answer is no. It's very difficult. As I said before, lead is a non-specific poison. its symptoms are very general. When the case is particularly severe, you will start seeing a head droop. They will not be able to lift their wings. They'll be on the ground. They won't be able to fly. You'll also start seeing green diarrhea, things like that. But those can also be symptoms of organophosphate poisoning. So it's very difficult to do it on a visual diagnosis alone.
Thanks, Linda. Lizanne, I'm going to put this one your way. This is also from Dale, and he's asking if SA Hunting Association participates in a lot of international efforts looking at educating, researching, and monitoring lead in their practices. And I know you mentioned quite a lot of the good work that you guys are doing locally. Do you have any international partnerships that you're working with?
So yeah, like I said, we're sitting on, we're a member of the IUCN. So if there are any initiatives under the IUCN, we would participate in that. But we're also a member of several hunting platforms in Africa as well as international. So lead is one of the issues that we will definitely take up on those platforms going forward. And then we've also contributed with some of the other members of the task team in discussions, for instance, on the African Eurasian Waterbird Agreement. If there are side events with discussions, we would participate in that. But yeah, we will definitely get more involved in this issue in future, and use all of our existing platforms and collaborations to try and get more momentum behind this issue. Yeah, so that's roughly what we're doing at the moment.
Thanks, Lizanne. It's wonderful to see the hunters coming to the table and discussing this very important issue with the greenies, as some of us are known. But awesome, thanks for answering that one. Ian, I'm going to put you with a bit of a loaded question here from Arno, and feel free not to give us an exact answer. But Arno is asking if there is any form of fixed time frame in terms of moving South Africa towards a lead-free industry.
Short answer is no, there's no fixed time frames. Some of the international agreements that South Africa has signed have time frames for developing a plan to work towards certain goals. So I think with the Waterbird Agreement, and I stand to be corrected, by 2020 we're supposed to develop a plan to go forward. So in other words, it's not a date by which things have to be done, but it's a date by which we're supposed to have a strategy or a plan or a timeline for taking things forward. I don't like talking about timeframes at this stage. I think we must work together and go at the speed at which the process can go, and it really does require having all stakeholders on board and commitment from everyone. So I think the correct approach is not to try right up front and set time frames and go hell for leather for those. I would rather spend a bit of extra time developing relationships, working with stakeholders, understanding the concerns. However, that being said, we don't want it to be an excuse for complete inaction. So there needs to be progress in terms of solving these problems. So yes, so you're right. There's not a simple answer to that. But we recognize that there's a lot of issues. We also recognize that overseas, even though this issue was first recognized in somewhere around about 1886 or somewhere around there. So we've known about it for a hell of a long time. And yet in America and Europe, there are still quite big impediments to solving the problem. So it's not a simple thing, it's not a trivial thing. But what we are trying to do in South Africa and Southern Africa is learn from some of the mistakes that have been made in some of those processes and not repeat those mistakes. And and some of what was done there, I think, created quite a polarized sort of environment that wasn't conducive to actually moving forward. So part of what we're trying to do is make sure we don't create such a polarized sort of environment that we kind of dig in our heels all around and we kind of don't get real progress. And we also understand that certain legislative things can only go so far. It really is about people understanding the issue and making voluntary commitments to change. So there's a very strong focus on awareness and in that way hoping to encourage people to make a voluntary change, no matter what the legislation says or no matter what the strategies say, and so on. So hopefully that will solve a large part of the problem. Thanks.
Absolutely. Thank you very much. And I think that was an excellently diplomatic answer to a very loaded question. So thanks for that. All right, we have run out of time, and I see there are still loads of other questions to be answered. So sorry, everyone, that we can't get to all of them during this live webinar. If you do have any burning questions for any of our speakers, you are welcome to either contact them directly or reach out to us at conversations@birdlife.org.za, and we will be sure to follow those up with the different speakers. I really like to thank Lizanne, Ian, Linda, and Vinny, who unfortunately I think has run out of bandwidth, for joining me this evening. That was a fascinating session on a very controversial topic, and I think everybody did a great job of really trying to stick to the facts and present the important science that is out there. So thank you to each one of you for the roles that you are playing in this movement, and I hope that as we move forward and learn more, we can make good change and good decisions going forward. So thank you for giving up your Tuesday night. Take care, everybody. Stay safe. And as always, keep your eyes on the skies and keep watching those birds. I will see you same time, same place next week, Tuesday. Good night, everybody. I will leave the webinar open if anybody would like to put some last parting comments in the chat feed. Thanks, everyone. Good night.